back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video we begin to discuss the moral theory of St. Thomas Aquinas. And one of the reasons this work by Aquinas fits well into this point of the class is that Aquinas marks an important transition but also relationship to the theory we saw from Aristotle. What we're going to see from Aquinas is that he looks at and discusses many of the same questions that Aristotle asks about human life. What is our fundamental purpose? How do we develop virtue? And ultimately, how do we live well and how do we live in accordance with reason? Aquinas is concerned with all of those things, and as I said, he does in some sense give similar answers. But of course, Aquinas is unlike Aristotle. He's not in the ancient period, he's in the medieval philosophical period, and he's also working within a religious and specifically Catholic and Christian context. And so it's actually a common saying to say that Aquinas baptized Aristotle. Because what we see from Aquinas is him taking up many of the themes, many of the ideas from Aristotle, and sort of converting them into a Christian worldview. And so it'll be helpful for us to compare these two thinkers to see how Aquinas builds on Aristotle's ideas and how he puts them into the context of a worldview which has a monotheistic God at its center. Okay, so to jump in, we should first say just a few things about the structure of the work we're going to be looking at. The reading you did was from Aquinas' most famous work, the Summa Theologica, and specifically his moral philosophy falls in the first part of the second part of that work. And it's worth saying a few things about what has come before it. So if you look at the first part of Aquinas' Summa Theologica, he goes through and he discusses the nature and existence of God. He starts off very early by asking the question, well, is the existence of God self-evident or does it need to be proven? He says it needs to be proven, and he famously provides his 5 ways, his 5 arguments for the existence of God, and then he goes on to discuss the various attributes of God. So the important point for our purposes is that the first part of the Summa Theologica is entirely focused on the existence of God and the nature of this divine entity. As we move into the second part, now we start to see Aquinas focusing on the nature of human beings. And he introduces this new topic with the following passage that begins the first part of the second part that I really think sets the stage for understanding what Aquinas is trying to get at. So here's what Aquinas says. Since man is said to be made to the image of God, insofar as image signifies what is intellectual and free in choosing and has power in its own right, now that we have talked about the exemplar, that is God, and about the things that proceed from God's power in accordance with his will, it remains for us to consider his image, i.e. man, insofar as he himself is a principle of his own works, in the sense of having free choice and power with respect to those works. So I think this passage is critically important for a few reasons. First, you see Aquinas appeal and reference the famous Bible passage from Genesis about the idea that man is created in the image of God. So in one translation, the passage reads, "So God created mankind in his own image, in the image of God he created them." Now this is an interesting idea, it's an interesting concept, but it's one that may not actually be readily clear. What does Aquinas mean by the image of God? What is the Bible supposed to be telling us when it says human beings are made in the image of God? Now, to some extent, if we accept the view that God is responsible for the creation of the universe and everything in it, then to some extent everything, down to the tiniest rock or ant or atom, has to be related in God to some degree. So when the passage says that humans are made in the image of God, it has to be something stronger than just saying that we're related to God in some way, because everything has to be related to God in some fashion. No, I think rather to think about what it means to be in the image of God is that there's something about human beings, there's something about mankind that is similar or participates in the divine nature. Now, of course, we are, in this view, we are not divine, right? We are physical beings. We live in the physical world, right? We're limited, we're finite, all sorts of things that do not apply to God. But the idea is that there's some aspect of us that is similar enough to God that we can say we're made in God's image. And of course, if you take that seriously, then it sets the stage for thinking about the question which Aristotle was very concerned with, namely the question of what is the highest good, what is the ultimate good for a human being? Now, if you accept that human beings are made in the image of God, that the highest part of us reflects the divine nature to some extent, then it would make sense to think our lives should be ordered around feeding and nourishing that part of ourselves and ultimately seeking to reunite with that of which we are an image. You might think if in this life we're simply an image of God, then this is an incomplete life. It's a limited life. It's not a life where we're entirely flourishing. It's a life where we're only partially participating in what we ultimately could be. And if that's all true, then it would make sense to think that the purpose and function of our life, to use Aristotelian language, would be to reunite with that of which we are merely an image. And of course, this is precisely what we're going to see as we continue reading. Aquinas is going to argue that the highest good for human beings, what he calls beatitude, is this uniting and returning to God. Okay, so we can see how this idea of being made in the image of God sets the stage for his ethics, but this still leaves a further question. Well, in virtue of what are we in the image of God? Let's return to the passage. Aquinas says it is because of what is intellectual and free in choosing and has power. So it's because of our intellect, it's because of our freedom and our power and ability to act. That is what he thinks it is about us that makes us in the image of God. Now, we might wonder briefly about why this is, right? I mean, why choose our intellect, our freedom, our power as those things which explain why we're made in the image of God? Well, think about the traditional classic conception of God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being that's infinite, that has no limits, that is not influenced by anything outside of itself. And then you think about human life. Now, it is undoubtedly true that we in many ways are influenced by many things outside of ourselves. Our parents and our culture and our society and our genetic makeup and all these things, all these environmental and biological influences have a real impact on our actions. Now, this is a controversial claim, at least in philosophical circles, but Aquinas thinks despite all that, we still have this sort of freedom. We still have a free will. And as we're going to see, Aquinas conceives of our free will as an ability to move ourselves, to be responsible and be accountable for our own actions. To not simply be determined by forces outside of ourselves. And if we in fact do have a power, even if it's limited, even if we don't always have that power, even if sometimes we do things for reasons we don't understand or we're determined by external forces, even if that does happen, if we at least sometimes have this power for free will to make our own choices and own determinations, then that's a little slice of the divine within us. Because God is said to be this being that acts of his own accord, that is not subject to any causation outside of God, is completely independent. And so it's just those moments where we can exercise our freedom and our free will and our intellect and to choose what the right thing to do is without just being determined like a robot by external influences. It is this ability we have, which at least in part, Aquinas says accounts for what it means to say we are in the image of God. And so, given that, it makes a lot of sense that what we see Aquinas doing is really digging deep into the nature of human action. So I want you to recall the very first sentence of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I'm going to be making some comparisons between Aristotle and Aquinas throughout. The very first sentence of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is, every skill and every inquiry, and similarly every action and rational choice is thought to aim at some good. So we said, well, what Aristotle is saying is nobody does anything for no purpose. No one does anything that's completely pointless. People do bad things, but we think there is some good of our actions. Even if the action isn't morally good, all things considered, there's at least some good that our actions are intended to bring about. And Aquinas agrees with this. But he thinks if we're going to find what it is that defines our human purpose, if we're going to find out how we can not just be the image of God, but ultimately achieve a full culmination in reuniting with God, we need to dig deeper in that. We need to ask, what specifically are the actions that we're concerned about when we're thinking about morality or ethics as applied to human life? So here's what Aquinas says. He says, among the actions done by man, the only ones that are properly called human actions are those that belong to a man insofar as he is a man. Now that's sort of a strange statement. He says, well, there's some actions that you do that belong to who you are as a human being and others that don't belong to you as a human being. And it might say, well, how is that possible? How can I do an action that doesn't belong to me? What would those sort of actions be like? Aquinas continues, he goes on to tell us, the only actions that are properly called human actions are those that a man is the master of. But a man is the master of his acts through his reason and will. This is why free choice is called a power of the will and of reason. Therefore, the actions that are properly called human actions are those that proceed from a deliberate act of willing. So that he says, look, there are some actions, human actions, properly human actions, that you are responsible for and you're the master of. And those are the actions that come from your reason and your will. Your will being your ability to choose, your reason, your ability to roughly to think and consider how you want to act and act on your own commitments and values. To engage in a thought process about what you should do. So the only actions he thinks that are truly human actions, the actions which set human beings apart from the rest of the natural world, are actions which proceed from our reason and our will. And there's tons of examples you can think of, right? Your decision to listen to this lecture, for instance, maybe you went through a thought process, well, I need to be ready for the assignments and exams and learn the material, so I'm going to choose to listen to this lecture. Or you say, well, I've been with my significant other for a very long time. Here are the reasons it would be a good idea to get married. So on the basis of my reason and will, I'll make that decision, right? There's all sorts of decisions that we see as proceeding from our own thought process and our own ability to choose. But then those are, he says, human actions. But then there's these other acts of man. These are things we do but don't truly belong to us. And what might he mean here? What are things we do that aren't the result of our reason and our will? Well, what Aquinas is getting at here is the strange way in which it seems that human beings, so to speak, live on the edge of nature. If Aquinas is right, then on the one hand, there's something divine and godlike about us, our reason, our will, and our freedom. On the other hand, we are also animals, right? We are physical beings, we are biological beings, shaped by the forces of nature. And if that's true, we're also going to be subject to the realities of animal life. Well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, there's all sorts of actions we undertake that are completely involuntary, that don't come from our reason and our will. For instance, breathing would be a good example, respiration, your heart pumping blood, your cells growing and dying. There's all sorts of things going on in your body that are completely involuntary. You have no control over. You don't have to think about, okay, breathe, then breathe. You can if you want, but you don't have to. You don't have any control over your cells, for instance, growing and dying off. Also, another important part of animal life, not just biological life, is the idea of instincts. So we, just like any other animal, have various instincts implanted in us by nature, and we act in certain ways without thinking about it, right? So you might use your reason and will to decide, where to eat and what to eat, but the fact that you do eat, the fact that you do sleep, right, the fact that you have an instinct for sex and procreation, all these things are built into you by your animal nature. And so this goes back to this idea that human beings are made in the image of God. If ethics is about how to live a proper human life, the first thing we have to do is delimit what is a human life constituted by. And Aquinas will say, well, of course, we are animals in a certain sense, so we have this biological life. But our truly human life, the life we live that can be a reflection of God, is these truly human actions, the one that proceed from our reason and our deliberation and our will and ultimately our freedom. So that is just to say, what he's concerned with in ethics or moral philosophy are those sorts of actions that proceed from our reason and will, and how to act properly in that sphere specifically. So we have seen that Aquinas believes that ethics is concerned with truly human actions that proceed from reason, deliberation, and our will. But the question is, what is our reason, what is our will doing? How does it operate? And here again we see another strong Aristotelian theme. He makes the point that all of our choices, all of our human actions, and as Aristotle says, all actions in general are for the sake of some end. So he says it must be the case that all agents act for the sake of an end. For if an agent were not fixed on some effect, then it would not do this rather than that. Therefore, in order to produce a determinate effect, it must be fixed on something specific that has the character of an end. So he makes a point here that if your ability to reason and deliberate and think about what you want to do and do that all freely, if that wasn't fixed on any purpose, if there wasn't any end that you were acting for, then you wouldn't do anything. Right? Because if there's no end, if there's no purpose which you're attempting to achieve through your reason and deliberation, your actions would either be totally chaotic because there's no purpose to what you're doing, or you just wouldn't do anything at all. You would just be constantly saying, well, I could do A, or I could do B, or I could do C, but I'm not really acting for any end, so what's the point? Why do anything? As he puts it, why do this rather than that? So all agents must act for the sake of some end. But what's interesting here is that when he says all agents, he doesn't just mean all human beings. In fact, he says, if you look out in nature, many non-human beings also act for an end. The entire animal kingdom, even we might say plants, act for an end. So again, he makes the point that in human beings with a rational nature, there's a specific way in which we pursue an end. Now, just as so Aquinas says, just as this specification, when it occurs in a rational nature through a rational appetite, is called a willing. When it occurs in other things through a natural inclination, it's called a natural appetite. So human beings, we pursue our rational appetites through an act of will. Right? There are certain things that our reason dictates to us that we should want, that we should desire, and we use our will or our ability to make choices to pursue those things. But what about other animals? What about dogs and cats and buffaloes and zebras, right? What about the rest of the animal world? What about even plants and trees? Well, non-rational nature also pursues an end, but they merely have natural appetites. They merely have appetites and desires and things that you might say, want in a certain sense, given to them by their biology, and they pursue them via instinct, or what he calls a natural inclination. And so here we get further explanation of this point that when Aquinas is talking about the end of human life and ethics for human beings, he's not primarily talking about us as instinctual, biological animal beings. He's talking about us as free beings with choice, will, and reason that are a reflection of God and the divine. But on this point, you might say that, so granted that there is this rational nature we have, which we act through our will, and there's a non-rational nature we have where we act through instinct, right? But what really makes those different, right? So when you see an animal that has various desires to satisfy its biological needs, thinking about the best way to do that, choosing the most efficient means to achieve that goal, how is that any different from when we decide where to go to lunch or what job to take to get the money we need to satisfy our basic desires? What ultimately is the difference between the choices that the non-rational animal world makes and the rational human beings make? So here's another way that Aquinas puts it, and I think to accept his picture of ethics and the goal of ethics is ultimately to take this assumption on board. Aquinas says, notice that there are two ways in which something tends toward an end in its action or movement. A, insofar as it moves itself toward the end, as a man does, and B, insofar as it is moved by something else towards its end, and the way that an arrow tends toward a determinate target, because it is moved by the archer who directs its action toward the target. So there are these two ways in which something can move toward an end. Now, he says, for non-rational nature, for plants and animals, they do act and move towards ends. But they move toward an end in the way that an arrow moves toward a target. When an arrow moves toward the target, the arrow doesn't understand what it's doing. It hasn't made a plan to move toward the target. It's entirely determined by something outside of itself, namely the archer. And in fact, we can see here that Aquinas means this to be an analogy for God and creation. Aquinas sees God as the archer in this case that gives animals the instincts that they need to move towards certain ends, gives plants the tendencies they need to move towards certain ends, that creates this whole system that coheres together. But then what about rational nature? Non-rational nature is moved because of something external, because of something else. But what about our human rational nature? He says we move ourselves toward the end. We are not the sort of being that is entirely controlled by something outside of ourselves. We can make our own choices, despite all the influences I mentioned earlier from our biology and society and upbringing. We can make our own free choices through our reason and our will. And because of that, we move ourselves toward the end. We are not like the arrow, we are more like the archer, which makes sense insofar as we are in the image of God. So we are self-movers to some degree. To the degree that God is, no, because God is influenced by nothing outside of God, and we, of course, are. But remember, we're in the image of God, and to that extent, we have some ability to move ourselves toward the end. So given that we have this ability to move ourselves, to make our own choices, the question then, of course, is what should our final ultimate end be, and how should we use our free will and our reasoning to get there? So to this point, we have seen Aquinas' view of human nature. We are a being with the ability to reason and act freely and move towards the ends that we choose. But of course, this leaves a lot to be explained, because to say that we have to use our reason to move toward our end is one thing, but we also might ask the question, well, what is our end? What should we be using our reason to move toward? What does our reason show us is the best goal or end or purpose to move toward? And of course, this is the fundamental question that Aquinas is going to get to in his ethics. And as a preliminary point, we first need to make a few claims about this final end. And we're going to see Aquinas make some very similar moves that we saw Aristotle make. So the first thing that Aquinas tells us is that whatever our end, whatever the final ultimate purpose and end of a human being is, he says, well, there has to be some final one. There must be an ultimate stopping point. And we see Aquinas argue for this in a way very similar to Aristotle. So remember the passage from Aristotle when he was saying, well, why not just think there is no final end? Every action we take leads to a further end and a further end and a further end on to infinity. And why did Aristotle think that was impossible? He said because this would lead to an infinite progression, making our desire fruitless and vain. And the best way to explain it again is that if there is no ultimate goal that we are pursuing with our actions and our desires, then why begin to act in the first place? If there is no ultimate end, then what is the point of beginning? And if there is no point in beginning, then there's no point to living in the first place. So Aristotle thinks we need some final ultimate end to make sense of our lives. Aquinas agrees with him here. For if there were no ultimate end, then nothing would be desired. No action would be terminated, and no intention of the agents would be put to rest. And deliberation would proceed to infinity and never come to an end. This is a crucial point for Aquinas. We're going to see that he thinks our final end is a state in which our appetite, all our desiring and willing, finally comes to rest. If you think about the nature of human life, it's constant willing and desiring and choosing one thing after another. right? So you get up and you need breakfast, and then you've got to do the dishes, then you got to hurry up and get dressed, then you got to go to work, right? It's one thing after another. You're constantly wanting something more and more and more and more. And to a certain extent, this makes life exciting, and you might say, some people would say it makes life worth living to have something to strive for, but it's also can be very difficult. It can be very onerous to always have something to do. There's certainly a lot of dissatisfaction involved when you desire something you can't have. The phenomenon of frustrated desire is quite real. So for Aquinas, if our ultimate good and happiness is to be found, he thinks it has to be found in something that will ultimately put all of that desiring, all of that willing, all of that striving finally to a rest. And I think this shows something important about Aristotle and Aquinas. Both of them think there must be some final end. And the reason they think this is because ultimately our lives would not make sense. They would lack purpose if there wasn't a final end. If it was all just choosing to infinity, all just constant striving and striving and striving with no end, we might say, well, life would be tragic. What would the point of all this be? Again, why begin if there's no end? And I think it shows something important about both of these thinkers, because both of them proceed on the assumption that life is not tragic in this way. Tragic things happen, horrible things happen in life. But at the end of the day, there is something that our lives are moving toward. There is a reason for the things that we are doing. It's sometimes talked about there's a view of life called nihilism, where nothing has any purpose, nothing has any meaning, nothing matters. This is ultimately what Aquinas and Aristotle want to avoid. They are not nihilists. They both think that life is not tragic in the sense that it's meaningless. Life is shot through with purpose. They may somewhat disagree about what that purpose is. Aquinas, working in a specifically Christian context, is going to tell us that fundamental purpose is reuniting with God. But both do absolutely agree there must be some purpose that makes sense of our lives. Now, of course, once you've agreed that there has to be a final end, there's still a further question. You might say, well, how many ultimate ends are there? How many final ends are there? And you could say, well, on the one hand, maybe there are many final ends. You might say there's multiple strings of actions, all of which lead to their own specific final end. So there's, think of Aristotle's previous examples. There's the art of military science leading to victory, and there's the art of medicine leading to health, and the art of business leading to money, right? So you might say, well, one answer could be there's all sorts of different ultimate ends. Each of one is valuable in and of itself. On the other hand, you might say, no, there has to just be one ultimate end. All those actions, all those crafts leading to health or wealth or victory, all of those have to cohere in one ultimate end. And what we see is Aristotle and Aquinas both arguing for this. And I have some passages from both. I'll just read one of them briefly from Aristotle. He says, "For now we take what is self-sufficient to be that which on its own makes life worthy of choice and lacking in nothing. We think happiness to be such, and indeed the thing most of all worth choosing, not counted as just one thing among others." Remember, Aristotle was on this quest to find out what is happiness, what is eudaimonia. And he said it has to be a self-sufficient good that doesn't depend on anything else, and once you have it, there's nothing further you want. It has to be something, he says, happiness is complete and self-sufficient. But then imagine that there were many ultimate ends. Wealth was an ultimate end, and victory and health was an ultimate end. Imagine that was the case. Well then, if you had spent your life pursuing health or wealth, once you achieve those things, there would still be something missing, namely the other ends that are also ultimate that you don't have in your life. So then, for this reason, Aristotle says, no, there must just be one final end, one ultimate end. And we see Aquinas very much agree to this extent. He says, therefore, the ultimate end must fulfill the whole of a man's appetite in such a way that there's nothing outside of it that's left to be desired. But this cannot be the case if something extraneous to its fulfillment is required. So remember, I just told you that Aquinas thinks our ultimate end is some sort of end to the constant willing and striving that characterizes our everyday lives. Our ultimate good is a state which puts all that to rest. But if there were more than one ultimate end, then there would still be something to strive for. There would still be something to want, something to desire. So we see Aristotle and Aquinas both united in this idea, not only that there is a final or ultimate end to our lives, but that there's just one ultimate end to our lives. And for Aquinas, it's an ultimate end that we need to achieve through what is specifically human about us, and more importantly, what is specifically in us that is a reflection or image of God. And in subsequent videos, we will examine what exactly does Aquinas think this ultimate single final end is. But I will stop here. Thank you for listening. I will see you next time.